They had already filled out the paperwork on the dog. He was pressed into the back corner of the last kennel in the row, as far from the bars as the concrete would let him get, his ears flat to his skull, and a low warning rumble rolling in his chest that never quite became a bark. A German Shepherd built like an athlete and shut down like a slammed door. 3 trainers had tried him that week, and the last one had backed out of the run with a torn sleeve and a verdict that everyone in the building now repeated like gospel. The dog was broken, dangerous, too far gone, and if the great Garrett Maddox himself had washed him out, then that settled it. The euthanasia was scheduled for Friday, and then a tall, weathered man with gray in his beard came slowly down the row, stopped at the last kennel, and did the one thing not a single person had thought to try with the dog everyone had given up on. He did not reach through the bars. He did not speak. He lowered himself down onto the cold concrete floor outside the run, folded his hands, and simply waited. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay with it until the very end. We read every single comment, and we'd love to know how far this one travels tonight. The man's name was Master Chief Petty Officer Jonah Pike, and he was 46 years old and had spent the last 3 years of his life proving, one dog at a time, that the word broken is almost always a sentence handed down by people who simply ran out of patience first. He was tall and lean and built for endurance, with iron-gray hair and a close-cropped beard and the slow, grounded way of moving that comes from a lifetime of working with animals who read your body long before they hear your voice. There was a thick scar across his left forearm and a permanent stiffness in one shoulder. His eyes were a deep, patient brown, unhurried eyes, the eyes of a man who had learned that the fastest way to lose a frightened creature forever is to rush it. Eyes that watched and waited and gave. Nothing they hadn't decided to give. He was not soft. 20 years in the teams had not left much soft in him. But he had learned the hardest discipline there is, which is the discipline of stillness, and it had become, in his retirement, the whole of his work. Pike had served 2 decades in naval special warfare, the last 12 of them as a SEAL military working dog handler, which meant he had spent half his career at the other end of a leash, trusting his life to an animal's nose and nerve. He had loved dogs that died doing their jobs and dogs that came home changed, and he had once, early on, very nearly washed out himself. A young operator the cadre had written off as too reactive, too damaged by a bad first deployment, until one old chief refused to give up on him and dragged him back from the edge of being thrown away. Jonah Pike never forgot what it was to be, the one everybody had already decided was finished. So when the teams were done with him, he'd bought a few quiet acres outside town and started taking in the dogs no one else would, the washouts, the bite cases, the untrainable ones a day from the needle, and rehabilitating them with the one tool the experts always seemed too proud or too rushed to use: time. He had never lost one yet. He did not intend to start with a shepherd in the corner. The dog had no name that anyone used. On the kennel card he was a number and a warning. He was perhaps 6 years old, which the trainers had cited as another strike against him. Too old? They said too set in his fear to start over. He was lean and powerful under a coat dulled by stress, and his body told the story his record didn't. The faded scars, the flinch that came before any raised hand, the way he tracked a person's hands instead of their face, the particular shut-down stillness of an animal who had learned that the safest thing to do with humans was to disappear inside himself and wait for the bad thing to pass. He was not a vicious dog. Jonah Pike had handled vicious, and this was not it. This was a dog who had been hurt so deliberately and so well that he had concluded the entire species was a threat, and who fought now only because fighting was the last thing he had left. Everyone who looked at him saw a broken animal. Pike, sitting on that cold floor, saw a dog waiting for one single human being to prove him wrong about the world. The shelter was a low cinder block building on the edge of town, and that winter the cold came hard off the fields, and the inside smelled of bleach and wet concrete and the particular exhaustion of a place that has to make terrible decisions every Friday. But the place that had broken the dog in the first place was somewhere very different. A sleek, expensive facility an hour up the road with a national reputation and a man's name on the gate. Garrett Maddox K9 Academy trained and sold protection dogs and police dogs at premium prices, and Garrett Maddox himself was a celebrity in the small world of working dogs, with a following, a brand, and a much-repeated slogan: "There are no broken dogs, only weak trainers." What the slogan concealed was that Maddox got his fast, marketable results through methods that relied on fear and force and pain, and that the dogs who didn't respond to being broken down, the sensitive ones, the ones who shut down instead of submitting, were quietly labeled defective and made to disappear, dumped at distant shelters or put down off the books, written off as the dog's failure rather than his. He had built an entire reputation on the idea that a dog he couldn't fix couldn't be fixed by anyone. He had said exactly that about the shepherd in the corner, on his way out the door 3 weeks earlier. That one's done. Too soft, too broken. I'd know. Put it down and don't waste anyone else's time. It was the verdict that had everyone at the shelter reaching for the Friday paperwork. It was also, as Jonah Pike intended to demonstrate, a lie. Pike sat on that floor for 2 hours the first day and did nothing but be present and unthreatening, and he left without the dog so much as looking at him. He came back the next day and did it again. On the third day, the rumble in the dog's chest went quiet for the first time. Pike adopted him before Friday, signed the papers, paid the fee, and walked a terrified, shut-down shepherd out to his truck on a long, loose lead. And on the drive home, he gave him the only name that felt right, because they had all called him Broken, and Jonah Pike named him for the thing that does not break. He called him Steel. The rehabilitation that followed took months and could not be rushed, and Pike did not try to rush it. The first week, he simply sat in the dog's kennel run with a book and a thermos and ignored him entirely, letting Steel learn that this human came with no demands attached. He let the dog choose every distance and set every pace. He tossed food without looking, building 100 tiny associations between this man and the only good thing a frightened animal trusts, that the hunger goes away. He never used a raised voice, because a raised voice was the language of the thing that had hurt Steel, and he never used a raised hand, because Steel watched hands the way other dogs watch faces, and Pike understood exactly why. Progress came in increments so small that anyone in a hurry would have called it failure. A day the dog ate while Pike was in the room. A day he didn't retreat to the corner. A day, weeks in, that Steel fell asleep within sight of a human being for the first time in his life, and Pike sat very still for 3 hours so as not to wake him. There were mornings of pure regression that would have broken a less patient man's faith. But slowly, the way a frozen thing thaws from the inside out with no single dramatic moment, only the steady accumulation of safety, Steel began to come back. The first time he leaned his weight into Pike's leg on purpose, the retired Master Chief had to look away and clear his throat, because he knew exactly what that lean had cost a dog who had every reason never to trust a man again. It was through a former employee of the academy that Pike learned the full truth, a young trainer named Tessa, who had quit Maddox's operation in tears a year before and had been sick about what she'd seen ever since. She told Pike about the methods, the ones that didn't make the promotional videos. She told him about the dogs that washed out and were never spoken of again, a steady, quiet trail of sensitive animals broken by force and then blamed for breaking. There had been more than 30 of them in the 2 years she'd worked there, she said, 30 dogs that had arrived sound and left ruined or didn't leave at all, and every one of them entered in the records as a defect, a genetic weakness, anything but the truth. She had kept records, dates, names, photographs, because someone, she said, ought to. She also knew the part that made it more than a private cruelty. Maddox sold his dogs to police departments across the region at premium prices, departments that trusted his name and had no idea that the calm, finished dogs they bought were the survivors of a process that had broken everyone, too gentle to endure it. And she recognized Steel immediately from the scar pattern and the file number. He had been one of Maddox's, a promising young dog whose sensitivity Maddox had tried to beat out of him, and failing had condemned. The dog the famous expert had declared permanently broken had not been broken by any flaw of his own. He had been broken on purpose by the very man whose reputation rested on the claim that he could not be fixed. And he was, under Jonah Pike's patient hands, getting better every single week. There was a setback, 'cause there always is. Maddox got wind that a retired SEAL with a backyard rescue was asking questions and rehabilitating one of his discards, and a man whose entire brand depended on being right about broken dogs could not allow that. He went on the offensive in the small world where his word was law, calling Pike an amateur, a sentimental hobbyist, warning the police departments who bought his dogs not to listen to some retired squid playing dog whisperer. And on a hard gray evening, Steel hit a wall, a sudden noise, a raised arm from a stranger at the feed store, and months of progress seemed to collapse in an instant as the dog dropped into the old terror, shaking, gone, looking at Pike's hands instead of his face for the first time in weeks. Standing in that parking lot with a trembling dog, Jonah Pike felt the doubt the experts wanted him to feel, the whisper that maybe they'd been right, that maybe some things really are too broken. He got down on the cold asphalt the way he had that first day at the shelter, and he waited, and after a long while Steele crossed the last few feet and pressed his head into Pike's chest and held it there, choosing trust over terror, choosing the man over the fear, and Pike understood that the wall hadn't been the dog failing. It had been the dog showing him exactly how deep the wound went, and trusting him to stay anyway. He stayed. The careful work went on, and Pike decided it was time to stop letting Garrett Maddox define what a broken dog was, in front of everyone. The chance came at the Regional K9 Exposition that spring, an event where Maddox always held court, demonstrating his dogs for the police buyers and the crowds and the cameras, the high priest of his own reputation. Jonah Pike registered quietly and brought Steele. And when the demonstrations were done and Maddox was basking in the applause, Pike stepped into the ring with the dog the great trainer had personally condemned to death as too broken to train, and asked, simply, for a few minutes. What the crowd watched next was not a display of force or dominance. It was a quiet, flawless conversation between a man and a dog, trust-based work of a precision that takes a master to produce and a sound animal to perform. Focus, control, complex tasks, a dog reading the smallest shift of his handler's body. A dog so far from broken that the police K9 sergeants in the stands began to murmur. Pike said nothing harsh. He never had to. And when it was done, he turned to the crowd and to Garrett Maddox standing frozen at the edge of the ring, and he told them whose dog this had been, and what the verdict on him had been, and who had handed it down. Then, with Tessa beside him and the records in hand, he told them the rest. He laid it out flat and complete in front of the buyers and the press and the cameras Maddox so loved. The methods that didn't make the videos, the trail of sensitive dogs broken by force and then disposed of as defective, the cover that there are no broken dogs, only weak trainers had always provided for a man who broke dogs for a living. He named the dates. He held up the photographs. He pointed out quietly that the very slogan Maddox had built a brand on was the perfect alibi. Because if every failure was the dog's fault and never the trainer's, then a man could ruin 100 animals and call each one a defect. Master Chief Jonah Pike, 20 years a SEAL, 12 of them at the end of a leash, said it with the credibility of someone the room could not dismiss, and the dog standing calm and whole at his side said the rest better than any words could. Garrett Maddox did what men like Maddox do. When the reputation they've hidden behind is finally held up to the light, he scoffed. He called it a stunt, called Pike a fraud, said anyone could cherry-pick one lucky dog and that his results spoke for themselves. And Jonah Pike simply let him talk, because the more a man like that says in a room that has already turned against him, the deeper he buries himself. And when Maddox ran out of words, the silence answered him. The police departments who'd built their K9 units on his dogs were already pulling away from him in real time, unwilling to be anywhere near what they'd just heard and seen. An animal welfare investigator who'd been handed Tessa's records had questions. The cameras Maddox had courted his whole career were now pointed at him for a very different reason. There were no theatrics. There rarely are. Just a man whose entire empire rested on the claim that a dog he couldn't fix was unfixable, being quietly disproven and exposed by the very animal he'd thrown away, while a retired SEAL stood with one hand resting on a dog's head and felt nothing like triumph, only the deep, clean quiet of a cruelty, long hidden behind a brand, finally dragged into the open. By the following summer, the account had settled the slow, honest way real accounts do. The cruelty investigation and the loss of every police contract, he had finished Garrett Maddox. The academy closed, the abuse cases moved forward, and the dogs still in his kennels were pulled out and placed with rescues that knew how to undo what he'd done. Tessa went to work for one of those rescues, and Steele, the dog 3 trainers had given up on, the dog the great expert had condemned to a needle on a Friday as too old and too broken to ever be anything, became living proof of how wrong a verdict can be. Jonah Pike trained him the rest of the way, and Steele passed his certification with a score that made the evaluator look twice, and then he found the work he was made for. He became a therapy dog, and on weekday afternoons he went with Pike to a facility for veterans wrestling, with the same invisible wounds Pike himself had once carried. And the broken dog, who had once concluded that all humans were a threat, now laid his head, gently and without fear, in the laps of men who had concluded the same thing about the world and showed them, the way only a creature who has come back from it can, that the conclusion was wrong. On a warm gold evening that July, Jonah Pike sat on the porch of his small house at the edge of his quiet acres and watched Steele run the fence line in the long amber light, fluid and joyful and afraid of nothing, a dog so far from the trembling animal in the back of that kennel that the two seemed impossible to reconcile as the same creature. He had 3 other dogs out there now, other untrainable cases other people had given up on, and Steele had become something Pike hadn't expected. Not just a success but a teacher, the steady one who showed the new frightened arrivals how it was done, how a dog learns to trust again. Steele finished his run and trotted up the steps and dropped down across Pike's boots with a contented groan. And the old scar pattern was just history now, just a map of a place he no longer lived. His tail moved slow and easy against the boards, and Jonah Pike rested his hand on the head of a dog the whole world had called broken, and thought, as he did every evening now, that broken had only ever meant not yet healed by the right hands. Sometimes the most damaging word we ever say about a living soul is the word broken, because once we've said it, we stop trying, we hand down the verdict and we walk away, and we call our own lack of patience the other one's lack of worth. Sometimes the dog, or the man, or the child everyone has written off as too far gone, too old, too damaged to start over, is not broken at all. They are only waiting, in the back corner where the hurt has driven them, for one person willing to sit down on the cold floor and not give up. We are quick to declare things ruined, but God does not deal in the word broken. He is in the business of restoration, of second chances, of bringing back what the world threw away. And He has a way of sending the right patient hands at the right hour to prove that nothing made with love is ever truly past saving. The verdict the world hands down is rarely the final word. There is almost always one more chance for the ones humble enough to sit down and wait for it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who has been called broken, or who has called themselves that, and needs to be reminded it is not the final word. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us, has someone ever refused to give up on you when everyone else already had? Your words tonight might be the light somebody is waiting for. And if you believe in stories of patience, redemption, and the healing that force can never accomplish, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, watch over every wounded soul still hiding in the back corner waiting to be reached, and remind you always, you are not broken beyond saving. You are not too far gone, and you were never meant to heal alone.